There's everybody. All right, aloha and welcome everybody. Welcome to the September 2021 edition of NDPTC's Third Thursday. Here in September 2021, we are still virtual. Something that we had hoped would be at least hybrid at this point, but we're getting there hopefully. Anyway, we're really glad that you have joined us for another of our Third Thursdays. If you're new to us, welcome. This is our chance to share some of the work that from people who we are fortunate to work with and have very interesting projects in that we're working on and areas that we want to share with the broader community. So thank you for joining us. We'll get started as always with our Executive Director, Dr. Carl Kim, to say a few words about the center and what we're doing and where we're at right now. Okay, Carl?
Well, it's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us virtually. I hope you all are staying safe and we've been very, very busy at the center. As you may know, we've been involved in doing some of the damage assessments from Hurricane Ida, and we deployed some of our teams using the Street View cameras for areas in Louisiana this week. And so I hope in a future Third Thursday, we can present some of the findings related to the damage assessment, primarily wind and coastal storm surge. And so I think there's lots of work that's going on, and I hope we'll be able to share some of that ongoing research and development work that the center is doing. The other announcement I wanted to make is that Dr. Lily Bui, who many of you may know because she's had an affiliation with NDPTC, has joined our staff as part of our NDPTC team. I don't know if she's on right now, but Lily has a PhD in planning from MIT, and she's previously worked at the Pacific Disaster Center, and then even before that, she's worked at our center as an intern and as someone that we're fortunate to have worked with. So for those of you who don't know Lily, please get to know her, and then also those of you who are familiar with Lily, please reach out and welcome her as part of our team. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Ricky to introduce our speaker.
Okay, so yeah, our speaker today is Dr. Clay Trauernicht. He's an extension specialist in ecosystems and fire at the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management for UH Mānoa. So on top of that, he also is the lead for the Pacific Fire Exchange, which is part of the Joint Fire Science Program, and it's a collaborative project making fire science usable by managers and the public. And Clay's research focuses on examining fire risk and ecosystem integrity in response to land use and climate. So we're really grateful to have Clay as the speaker today, and excited to hear his presentation. So thanks, Clay.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the introduction. Let me bring up my screen here. So I'm gonna switch to PowerPoint. All right. And then switch it to presenter view here. Whoops. All right, everyone see that okay? Thumbs up. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. So I've been working on fire in the Pacific for quite a while. I was kind of had an extension position that was focused almost solely on fire, and more recently I've kind of started a new appointment still the same department, same college, but looking more at ecosystems more broadly, right? So trying to kind of expand fire as one of those impacts, along with all these other things that folks in the Pacific, working in the Pacific, are familiar with. So like weeds, lots of invasive species, and things like that. And I just want to say that, you know, the stuff I'm going to be talking about today has been really facilitated by many collaborators and funders. So folks like U.S. Forest Service I've been working with, I have current projects with, funded by the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center, like you said, Joint Fire Science Program, collaborators, nonprofit organizations like Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. And so just like going to be giving this overview, but a lot of this stuff has really been facilitated by these kinds of partnerships. And it kind of allowed me to be thinking about this kind of stuff. So kind of this generic title, it's like the same title I always give, because it's really, fires really linked back to people, and that's kind of the sort of lesson I think from today. And I think a lot of these themes and ideas were I got an opportunity to write about recently in a op-ed I was asked to write for The Hill, I think in light of all these fires we've had in Hawaii lately, especially this big one on Hawaii Island. But I'll just dive in here. Today, I'm really going to be talking about three big ideas. First, that we have a relationship, a very close relationship with fire. People do in general across the world. And that fire regimes, which I'll get into what I mean by that, are shaped by people, right? So we have to have an active hand to play in these things. And so what we choose to do and what we choose not to do really can make a difference. And unlike natural disasters like hurricanes and things like that, like we actually can dictate the ways in which fire affect landscapes in lots of different ways. And so it's really important to kind of look at fire as a way to understand how we can reduce and how we have kind of increased our vulnerability to climate change, right? So I'm going to be getting into climate and what that means for fire as well, with respect to the Pacific Islands. And ultimately, like what I'm going to try to make here is that our relationship with fire is kind of broken, and a lot of people, especially kind of in Western developed countries, kind of have lost this idea of like fire as a tool, which has been fundamental to humanity for, I mean, this goes back pre-Homo sapiens. I mean, this is how long our relationship with fire is. So I'm going to start off with this kind of cool, just to give you a sense of like what fire, how prevalent it is across the world. This is a really cool animation that NASA put together using MODIS satellite hotspot detections. And so what we're seeing in this video is the green up and brown down of vegetation, right? With seasonality, rainfall seasonality, and then actually active fire detections across the world. So you can see this kind of wet, dry season cycles happening, as well as summer, winter cycles happening. And when you get dry season and summertime is really when you're going to see all of these hot spots, these active fire detections light up. So you can see dry season across Southeast Asia, the summertime right now, kind of in the boreal, across Russia. Africa is kind of known as the fire continent. So we're seeing like these cycles of wet, dry season shifting from north and south of the equator. And the minute the dry season starts, right, these fires just light up the landscape. And almost all of these fires are started intentionally by people for a wide variety of uses. So improving pasture, getting rid of insect pests, clearing land for agriculture. So there's tons and tons of applications and uses of fire. And so this kind of goes back to that, what I was talking about earlier, is that the relationship that humans have had with fire goes way, way back and is still present in many parts of the world. And so extending into the US is when we really see these kind of temperate seasonal effects of fire. So just this idea to kind of put it out there that, you know, we have this longstanding relationship with fire. It's an incredibly prevalent process on a global scale. And, you know, just if you take nothing else from this video, that we can't deal with fire through fire suppression, right? That's just not a viable option in the long term. And a lot of these lessons just kind of remind me that I was exposed to this perception of fire working in Arnhem Land for my PhD, so Northern Australia. And again, it's in this context where fire is used as a tool for lots of different purposes, hunting, kind of clearing vegetation. For them, for folks there, it's more like cleaning landscape, right? So it's a way for that they use to manage these landscapes. And so when we see something like this, I don't know if any of you guys saw this image, but it's, you know, kind of the question for us is like, is this alarmist? Like, are we being alarmist, right? I mean, I think the point of this image is to kind of say, hey, like, pay attention, wake up, what the heck is going on? And of course, we're seeing some of these fires on the mainland extend beyond our capacity to control it. But at the same time, fire plays a role in these ecosystems in particular, right? So a lot of these coniferous forests depend on fire for regeneration. And I was able to capture the Hawaii equivalent of this, right? So, I mean, should we be alarmed by this kind of imagery? This is Makaha Valley in 2018, right? So I don't know if folks remember, it's not that long ago, but almost the entire west side burned up on these fires. You know, so we had about 5,000 acres or so that ripped across this the west side. And you can see in Makaha, the golf course is one of the few things that didn't burn during this incident. So again, sort of like, you know, what kind of impacts are these having, like what kind of concern should we have for these sorts of events? And I mean, obviously something like this is pretty dramatic, and kind of fits into these idea that are things changing, right? The question we should be asking, are things changing, and are things a little bit out of control? This is what the scene looked like when I drove around the south side of the island, coming up right just past Nanakuli, right, on that during that fire. It's sort of shocking to see these impacts on the ground, and very sort of seemingly out of place for Hawaii. But again, we saw it again the next year, right? 2019, I'm sure this got lots of press. Folks saw this, the 2019 fires on Maui. I think over 20,000 acres burned in a single summer, and continued into the next year. 2020, there's large fires on Maui. Almost a third of Kaho'olawe burned. And so all of these things, I'm kind of giving these examples, not to say that, oh my gosh, what's going on? Things are so dire, but just to say that this is prevalent. It's a prevalent feature in our landscapes. And of course, the big one more recently that's getting all the press, hopefully this little video will go, is the Mono Road fire that just happened on the Big Island last month. Actually, it started July 31st. So 40,000 acres, the largest fire we have on record. Largest, there's actually one that happened in the 60s that was mapped, and it's bigger than this one, but very, very significant event, impacted a lot of communities along the fringes of this fire. And so the real surprising thing, I think, for most people is that this actually is not unprecedented. And Hawaii had this huge fire that happened in 1901, burned 30,000 acres and lasted 3 months. And it's really interesting to me to kind of look through these histories, because what we got from this fire was the forest reserve system. So the first forest reserves were started, and all those, they initiated a fire warden program, which essentially became the Division of Forestry eventually. And so these fires have had an impact in Hawaii's history as well. And it also, I just love this quote, because you know, it points to the knowledge and the awareness that the resources that we were worried about back then are the same things we're worried about today, right? So these watersheds and how they provide water for our communities was the major concern more than 100 years ago. And this is what it looks like. So the other thing we got after that fire is regular reporting for fire incidents. Annual area burns over the past century plus shows that we kind of are going from pretty mild fires not playing that big of a role to a big change in the past few decades. This big spike in the 60s was that one historical fire that was bigger than the Mono Road fire. But as you can see, as we come into the more recent decades, it does seem kind of like we're running off of a cliff. And if you extend this out into the Pacific, it kind of becomes even more surprising. And so I've been working on the fire history stuff and looking at drivers of fire with a bunch of collaborators, U.S. Forest Service, Christian Jardina, Susan Cordell, and Abby Frazier, with some funding from the Pacific Island Climate Adaptation Science Center. And we've been able to kind of look at these regional characterizations. And so when you look at this figure here, it's actually the percent of island land area burned annually. And so you can see Hawaii is on the left side there. It's relatively small, but it is actually quite comparable to the Western states in the US, that figure. But when you look at these other islands, huge proportions of their lands are burning, with as much as 10% on Guam in their worst fire year. That would have been during the El Nino, 97, 98. And just 4 years of fires that the U.S. Forest Service has mapped on Guam just shows how prevalent, how extensive fire is on these islands. So it's again, this is something that we need to be thinking about and grappling with beyond just suppression, right? This is not something we're just going to put these fires out, right? I think it drives that point home. And so, well, how to explain what's going on here? I'm going to give you a little bit of fire science. Basically, here we've got fire behavior, which is this dictates like where and how a fire is going to move across the landscape. This becomes really important when we're talking with suppression versus the idea of fire regimes. And the fire regime is really these longer term patterns. And so how does climate, ignitions, and vegetation all kind of interact to drive these patterns that we see over time and that affect these landscape scale patterns? And pretty simply, for the Pacific, at least, the ignitions are almost entirely driven by people. And I'll get into that, why that is. But I think on Hawaii, we've been able to look at these records of some records that actually have determined causes, and it's about 98% are human caused. There's a little bias towards lava ignited fires just because it's easy to determine when a lava starts a fire, but we've got very little sources of natural ignition, as lightning strikes are very infrequent in the island. So almost all fires are caused by people. The other factor we see driving these changes is this widespread expansion of grasslands and savannas. And I'll also talk about how those differ across these islands and sort of over time versus kind of contemporary patterns. But as these grasslands become more prevalent, right, you can imagine how much more prone to burning they would be than, say, forests, right? We've tried to hold a lighter up to a dry clump of grass versus next to a tree. You can imagine which would ignite more easily. And then we have this climatic processes going on, right? So there's these patterns. We sort of see wet, dry seasonality that we know quite well in Hawaii, as well as these El Nino, sort of these longer term climatic cycles. And so those of you on the call might be very familiar with El Nino driving these region-wide, Pacific-wide droughts, right? And to which we've actually seen very large fires, even in some of these wet islands, places like Pohnpei, Chuuk, that would experience pretty dramatic fires during these droughts. So like I said, contemporary patterns are really obvious. They drive this point home that almost all fires are caused by people, and they're incredibly prevalent. So in Hawaii, there's this like perfect linear relationship with the number of ignitions and the number of people. And we're experiencing anywhere between 600 to 800 ignitions, wildland fire ignitions per year across the state. And the most prevalent is on Oahu at about 600 per year. So these are kind of happening all the time. The fact that so few of them become large fires speaks to the effectiveness of the county fire departments in particular. You know, they're able to get on most of the fires pretty quickly and keep them small. So it's only about 5% of these fires that actually turn into these large, 100-acre plus events or incidents. But in the grander scheme, kind of we can look at what's causing these things on a longer term historical perspective. And like I said earlier, like lightning strikes are incredibly rare. So this little global map shows the frequency of lightning strikes per year. So you can see this big empty spot over the Pacific. And that's just because we don't have the land mass to kind of get this heating effect that drives these convective forces that drive lightning patterns. And so what that means for islands is that people brought fire, right? So we can really clearly link burning and sort of the changes that causes on these islands to the arrival of people. I mean, just like the rest of the world, fire is a fundamental tool and continues to be a fundamental tool for managing lands across the Pacific. And there's very cool charcoal evidence from the Western Pacific. This is from Guam. It's a little bit flipped backwards from my perspective, but basically here's kind of now going backwards in time the other way. And what these figures are showing is charcoal is the solid line here, and these other lines are different savanna adapted plants. So things like glycinia, which is a luhe, you guys might be familiar with that here, and different grasses, so poaceae and lycopodium or club moss. And what you see is on Guam, right at about human settlement, about 35 to 4,000 years ago, we see this dramatic increase in fire and a dramatic increase in fire adapted plants, which means that these savannas essentially are spreading the minute people arrive. So all of a sudden we're getting this right? This kind of connection now between ignitions, people starting fires, right? And these grassland savanna expansion, right? So these are going to like the part of this interaction that's happening over long time periods for the Pacific Islands, relatively speaking. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is Ramong Island on Yap, a recent fire that I got really lucky to go out and check this out with Margie Fallon, who is standing there. She's with the U.S. Forest Service. I think she's about to retire. Of course, folks from Guam would be very familiar with the south of the island, where you get these huge expanses of savannas. This is by Climatic above in the mountains above in southern Guam. So these grasslands in the tropical Pacific are pretty much 100% anthropogenic, right? They're human derived. And this is the kind of, but looking at this is what we're talking about. What we're actually describing right here is the grass fire cycle. And this is something that's fundamental research really emerged from Hawaii, looking in the national park to some of these patterns and impacts of fires on forest cover. And what you get to see is you get these forests adjacent to grasslands. The grasses catch fire really easy. They burn into the forest, and the trees are a little bit slower or less adapted to fire, especially given the absence of fire for so long on tropical Pacific Islands. And then the grass is established. Once those trees die, grass is established there, and you sort of get this expansion of grass lines. And what's happening on Hawaii is we're seeing is kind of this is eroding the forest edge, especially on our drier sides. So you're kind of seeing the shrinking lower edge of the forest up the watershed. That's the big concern for Hawaii. And very extensive grassland, as I said. So Guam is almost 25% of the island land area is covered in savanna. Palau, people will get shocked because everyone goes to Palau for diving, and they're like very surprised to hear that there's all these savannas interspersed with forests there that burn very frequently. Yap, for example, 17% forest cover. So very extensive savannas, and as you can see, they're just interspersed all throughout forest cover there. Hawaii is a little bit of a different situation in that our big driver of fire right now is actually agricultural decline, combined with all these weeds that we have here, these fire adapted weeds. So the biggest correlation that you can find between this huge jump that I was mentioning in recent fire activity is this huge decline we've seen since about the 60s in active agriculture. So both pasture and cropland, we've seen about 60% declines in both of those. So the footprint of our agricultural production system is decreased. And when you stop farming a place, I mean, anyone that's familiar with kind of any island, right? You drive through central Maui nowadays, go up H2 on Oahu, like what do you see? I mean, it looks like there should be elephants and rhinos and things like that. It's just tropical savanna. And all these species are very, very well adapted to burn and do so regularly. So there's a little bit of a difference in comparing Hawaii to these Pacific islands. And when we look at these grasslands and the distribution across the islands, in Hawaii, this is where all our fires are, right? So this is the dry side of Big Island, and all the fires for the past 20 years or so are mostly in that kind of belt between Kohala and Hualalai over there. But same thing on Maui, and actually this doesn't even include the 2020 fires, but you know, southern Maui, West Maui, and in the Central Valley there, Molokai, all on these grassland areas. The purple, sorry, I should say, is our forest cover. The green is grass cover for these islands. Same for Oahu, right? It's the west side, the dry side, but also in the kind of North Shore area there by Mokuleia. And on Kauai, their big hotspot is down here above Kekaha, former sugarcane land, right? It's all just grasses and Halikoa now. And then I kind of have a sinking suspicion, but just from my time on Yap, that this is a similar pattern may have played out here. And it's kind of important to remember that, you know, in Yap, I think the population is 10% of what it was when, you know, Europeans first contacted folks there. And if you look at the savanna landscape across the back there, you'll see all these furrows, and in the foreground, all these furrows. And this is all ditch systems for agriculture. So we may have seen similar patterns that may have contributed to the increase in fire prevalence in the tropical Pacific, as well as agricultural land use has declined, but kind of prehistoric declines in this. So where does this leave us? I think the kind of transition point here is just that not only are we interacting with sort of people and vegetation, but you have this climate effect that I was mentioning. And we have kind of a 1-2 punch for tropical savannas globally, but for the islands in particular, it's not just drought, right? So it's not just like our conditions dry now, but one of the big contributing factors is actually prior rainfall. And what we end up seeing is that when you get really heavy rainfall events, because there's so much grass everywhere, these species respond very quickly and they produce lots and lots of biomass in response to that rain. So you get this increase in fuel load. So you just increase in the quantity of fuels that there are to burn. So if you get prior rainfall, followed by drought, that's kind of this 1-2 punch. And it's actually particularly prevalent during El Nino years. So you have seasonality of rainfall, so really distinct dry seasons. We're familiar with this in Hawaii, but what's interesting in the Western Pacific out in Palau through Guam and Yap is they're actually influenced by the Asian monsoon. So very, very distinct dry seasons. And so they're getting fires each year as the dry season set in. And then we also have climatic sweet spots, especially in Hawaii, given the effects of topography, right? So when you got this orographic rainfall effects where we have these dry leeward sides, and I think this one figure, and hopefully I think this is the last data figure I'm going to show, but this is really important to understand here. This is the probability of fires. This is actually sampled from real fires in Hawaii as a function here of mean annual rainfall, but it's split between 3 vegetation types. And the point to take home here is see these grasslands in the light gray. When you have grass, you are more likely to burn, and you are kind of shifting you're more likely to burn, and you're also more likely to be sensitive to these rainfall events, right? So as we expand these grasslands, we've essentially just been increasing the probability of fire occurring across the landscape, and it's kind of through these red and orange zones across all these islands is that sweet spot. And here's kind of evidence. We did some modeling. I did some modeling on Big Island. So if you kind of compared to like fire probability under a current climate, if you look at year of fire drought, right, this increases probably. The pink just designates an increase in probability. So that's as you'd expect. I think the bigger surprise was just how powerfully the effect of prior year rainfall. So when you have additional rainfall or above average rainfall the year before a fire happens, you get a very similar effect. And in some states, some cases, a larger effect than the year of fire drought. So what this is challenging is because most mainland models for fire risk prediction only incorporate drought. And so we need to be thinking about how these sort of longer term dynamics affect fire risk down the road. It's kind of cool because it gives us a little more lead time to prepare for these things. But it also means that we're sort of stuck figuring out our own little indices to try to predict these things. And then of course, because we have these extensive grasslands, as climate changes and is predicted to increase in dryness on these leeward areas in particular, what we're seeing when we project that fire risk forward is a dramatic expansion of these areas that are most likely to burn and actually a shift Mauka. And so this becomes especially troubling for watersheds, because all of a sudden what you're doing is kind of moving those areas of higher fire risk closer to where we have our kind of threatened forest resources and these resources that are critical for watershed protection. But in addition, again, like what we've seen with these grasslands and decline in agriculture, what that means for our communities is that sort of the risk has increased under their feet. So it's not like we're in the Western US and building into fire prone regions. We've seen fire risk increase around our communities, kind of where they sit. Again, these are kind of these factors. They sort of let us understand what and why things are happening. But the other benefit of this kind of system and model looking at is it points to ways which we can intervene and try to reduce this vulnerability. And in particular, human caused ignitions mean that education and outreach should be able to kind of reduce some of those ignitions, but then the only direct intervention we can make is with vegetation, right? So vegetation management becomes a really critical tool into reducing risk around our communities and around these resources that we care about. And so there's kind of a national push to sort of bring these pieces together, called the Cohesive Strategy for Wildland Fire Management. I think it was kind of put out, I want to say around 2014 or so. And this is sort of like this cross-agency effort to say, like, what do we need to do? Who are the players, right? And how do these pieces fit together? And I think for us in Hawaii, the way we look at this is like fire resilient landscapes and fire adapted communities, right? And that's kind of saying, here are the things we know that can help deal with fire, mitigate fire risk. And then how do we pull that together and make it locally relevant? Because it's really the people on the ground that have the knowledge of both the resources there and the capacity to kind of intervene. And so fire resilient landscapes, I'm talking about pretty straightforward stuff like fire breaks and strategic fuel breaks. So areas where you're managing along roadsides, but doesn't need to just be mowing and cutting grass. This is an example on Oahu and Waianae Kai, where you could have the existing Haulikoa guinea grass vegetation on one side and this belt of native trees planted on the other side. This actually allowed the Division of Forestry to go in and work this road. They didn't have to worry about the fire jumping behind them. So they could actually use this road as a safe space to come in and work on the fire. You can scale this up to the landscape. So like that climate model or the fire model that I was kind of showing you guys can be used to look at what happens when you switch land cover. And so the example that we worked on was at Pu'uawa, another forest reserve on the Big Island, where it's predominantly grass. So this light green is all kind of grass pasture. And so we just did a scenario like, what would happen if you just restored the whole thing back to forest? I mean, just as a, as a hypothetical. And what you see is when you project future fire risk is that you get a pretty big difference in terms of reduced fire risk under these future scenarios. So reforestation can be used as a tool done at the right scales. And then just getting agricultural back on the land. So grazing is just this critical tool. And like I said, I've been working on fire here for a little while now, about 8 years or so. And in Waianae in particular, we finally just kind of have the right people have come together, and we've got this fire break we've been working on. This is Bula. He's working on his farm, and he got impacted by those 2018 fires and decided to go from aquaculture to sheep just to protect the farm. So trying to put these people and strategies in the right places to kind of increase the resilience of these landscapes to fire. Kind of bridging that, I think that was mentioned at the beginning, I manage this project called the Pacific Fire Exchange. This is a part of this national network of these exchange groups, and we're just trying to get information out that's relevant for management. So help with planning, help with the fuel break design, things like that, and just try to make the case for more work putting into this effort, mitigating fire risk at the landscape scale and just informing people about what the situation is. I mentioned these guys also at the beginning in terms of fire adapted communities. I think at the forefront is Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. So they're a nonprofit based on the Big Island, and they've been doing this stuff since about, I think, 2001. Everything from fuels management to like Firewise communities, large scale statewide planning effort, community wildfire protection plans, these kinds of things. And again, really focusing a lot of their effort most recently has been getting communities to get engaged, right? So what are the resources that these communities have? Are there steps they could be taking to kind of keep their neighborhoods safer from wildfire? We coordinate with agencies across the state to kind of do these annual rollouts when the fire season's coming or when we're in drought, just to kind of get the word out to, again, try to educate the public about strategies they can take at the home, but also just to be aware of reducing the risk of ignitions. And I just like to kind of bring this back into the bigger scale thing. What we're talking about here is, these strategies allow us to kind of envision how we want these landscapes to look, right? And so this idea of, degradation versus restoration over the long term. And this is putting this slide in here is really just reminding me, like, fire provides a model to kind of understand different ways to do this. But it also is a reminder that it ultimately depends on these communities, right? It comes back to community capacity again and again. And especially like those most recent fire, it was Hawaiian Homestead at Pu'ukapu that bore the brunt of this fire. And so when it came down to it, they were there pretty much on their own trying to deal with this. And so this is where we have to really think about, in the broader scheme of society, what kind of capacity, how are we supporting people at that level? Because if people have what they need, the basic fundamentals taken care of, are we going to be able to expect them to kind of tackle these kinds of problems at landscape scale? And that's really the scale we need to be thinking about moving into the future. And this just again and again, this is from this big global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services, but it echoes the same message from the recent IPCC report, this call for transformational change, right? And like really, I think it's on us to kind of be critically thinking about what does that mean, right? How do we actually like empower communities, empower society as a whole to really be in a position to make these kinds of changes? Because as I said, we cannot deal with fire through suppression alone. It's going to take preventative, proactive mitigation efforts to deal with this. And if we're not sort of have strong, cohesive a society, right, we're not going to really be able to cope with the trajectory in which we're headed in the grander scheme of things with climate change. So at that, hopefully I haven't run over. And I'll tie it off. Just thanks for listening. I know it's kind of impersonal here, being on a screen and watching lots of other little screens, but you know, if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Clay. That was a really great, very informative presentation in which you covered really a lot of ground, which I think is quite relevant to the work of the center and others that are engaged in this. It might be a little bit helpful if you could say a little bit more about the Pacific Fire Exchange, and then perhaps some of the relationships that you may have with, I mean, I think you're familiar with NDPTC and our relationships with FEMA and other organizations as well too. So I don't know if you could say a bit more about you know, the work that you're doing, the capacity building, the types of training that you're doing. I'm sure there will be other questions as well too. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So the Pacific Fire Exchange is part of this national effort by the Joint Fire Science Program. So the JFSB, this is basically the premier federal level funding organization for fire research. And I want to say about 12 years ago or so, they realized that all of this research they were doing actually wasn't getting implemented. It wasn't being used by people on the ground. So they decided that they needed to do something about that. And so they developed this idea to kind of establish these boundary organizations. So it's kind of, they split the US up across the regions, and the Pacific was one of those regions. And the idea is, if we develop these exchanges, what we really want to do is build relationships with managers who are going to use this information on the ground and tie them into the research that's being done. And so it's two-way exchange of knowledge, where you're sort of saying, okay, here are the needs on the ground. You know, do we have research that's addressing that? If not, let's get the research to address those questions. And then if there's research available that addresses those questions they have, how do we make it accessible? And really that's where, so in the context of the PFX, it's been much more focused on kind of land management, conservation, as well as fire management. Like, what are people kind of making these decisions at kind of larger spatial scales with respect to natural resources doing? But then over the course of working with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization in particular, we've also done a lot of work with at the kind of homeowner level, right, or community level, even with farmers, things like that. So anybody who's kind of dealing with fire risk, making sure that they're just using the best practices available, but also just kind of trying to track like questions that they have, and are the information resources out there. So we do all kinds of stuff like workshops and field trips. Like I said, everything's been virtual, obviously lately, but as well as these sort of fact sheets and technical guides. And that's kind of the, again, sort of the bread and butter of extension, right? Are these kinds of products, educational products and activities. And, you know, so we do a lot of interactions also just to understand, like, are even these formats of information sharing effective, right? So it's kind of the ongoing work, and we get to interact with the folks on the other exchanges to kind of develop new tools and figure those things out. So it's pretty, it's a really kind of a great group to work with.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. I think Bethany had a question or comment. Bethany, do you want to speak?
Sure. Good afternoon. Hi, Clay. I think we met at a climate change boot camp a few years ago in Ka'u.
I remember.
We just started working on our climate adaptation plan, and we're trying to gather all the climate projection data available and any GIS work, and just wondering if any of the images you were showing, if there's any model out there that you've developed for these sort of wildfire risk projections.
Yeah, I have that one I was showing is like this last one version of it, and it's just that sort of northwest corner. And the reason I just did it for that, it had the longest available fire history at the time. But I actually have statewide now current conditions, fire risk maps, and the next step, which is forthcoming shortly, will be the projections for the future. And so I can share those with you. I know Kevin Sullivan, right? He has bugged me about it before. And I tried a kind of preliminary version for him based on the old models, and it didn't quite work, but the new ones are working on it. I can share those directly with you. Again, I have the current maps, but then the future sort of just plugging in the rainfall. It's not that much. It's very close. I'll just say that, to being shareable.
Awesome. Thanks. We can connect offline.
Yeah.
Great work,
sure.
Clay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Are there other, Don, it's good to see you too. Don, do you have a question or comment?
West Maui.
I do, and thank you so much. You know, I always want to try to get onto these Zoom sessions, and I don't know, it's like lunchtime or something, so I'm always eating. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for your informational session, and it's really great to see everybody on it. So, you know, I live on West Maui, and I was thinking about what you were saying about the wildfires and how basically the wildfires move up toward Mauka and you have less watershed. So on West Maui, there's a lot of people like Laniapoko and Oluwalu who, you know, they've become this actually fire-wise community, even though quite there's not a lot of water there. So I'm just wondering for West Maui, what do you see in terms of the future? And it's kind of a loaded question because, you know, with water being an issue and permitting, just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's this funny thing because you actually, some of the climate models start putting us into areas, especially along the coast, where the models are basically predicting that it's going to become so dry that there's not going to be enough water for vegetation to grow, right? So you actually see some decrease in fire risk in some places. I think that it's not so much, I question the accuracy of the model in those cases because we get so much variability, right? That I think it's really that seasonal variability in rainfall that we need to worry about more so than these average changes, right? So that average change kind of paints a picture about where you think things are going to kind of become worse. And yeah, I think that, for example, like looking at Central Maui, you have potentially opportunity to, I mean, if you have access to water, that's the easiest way to alter the vegetation in a way that will become less likely to burn. And so the same would kind of hold for the West Maui in that sense of like, if agriculture stays, because there's still the possibility of agriculture, if there's opportunities to expand agriculture, you know, even coffee, they don't burn. Farms aren't going to burn. Like it's the vegetation around these things that are going to burn. And, you know, what are we struggling with there? It's not so much fire. It's the price of real estate versus the money that's the value of farming, right? And so that's, again, when I kind of think about these transformative shifts that are required, that's part of it. It's like you know, I mean, it's not to get too deep into things, but like if you're saying that the value for this land, all it has, or the most value it has, is for real estate development, then it's never going to be profitable to farm, right? So now you have to look at like, what are the ways in which we can kind of either, what are the opportunities we have to kind of manage those lands around these resources? And I think that's where the real questions and kind of room opportunities are in thinking for the future. I don't know if I probably didn't answer your question at all, but
no,
that's
you
the kind of way I think about it.
I think it's so complex with different areas where everybody lives. And so everybody has a different scenario, what they're facing. And at the end of the day, you know, native plants maybe are the key to some of these areas, but water is very scarce on West Maui. And, you know, there's local infighting and regular fighting and local development. And, you know, as you know, West Maui is one of the areas that have the most hotel businesses. So it's kind of like a give rob Peter for Paul, maybe, I guess. I don't know. But
Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the same thing. It's like, is fire risk and the occurrence of these fires and the potential future impacts enough to warrant like an intervention? Or, you know, like this is the idea of the green fee for visitors, right? Like if you, when you go to Palau, you got to pay $100 so they won't let you back on the airplane, right? When you leave, like it's $100 for and it goes all the conservation. And Hawaii has nothing like that, right? So you can imagine if you want to fund it, it's more just like political will. It's not like, is there money for it? It's right. It's like, how do you decide what is the risk? Are the impacts that it's having worth mitigating? And if you decide they are, but again, these are these like hard problems because it kind of needs to be collective, right? And then frankly, with the Firewise community approach, it's really like what you're saying is like, all right, yeah, homeowner, and you're making your mortgage and you're sending your kids to school, whatever. Oh yeah, and you have to take care of this, like, and you have to like do fire prevention around your neighborhood. I mean, it's a lot to take on, and it's a lot to ask. And so I think some of these more systematic approaches are going to be what's needed moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm really glad to see John Canter here because he's finishing his MERP and DMHA capstone and doing really related research. So John, you had a question or comment to add to this?
Yeah, I'm interested. You say that you talked a lot about how fires can't be totally suppressed and we have to live with them. So how do you think Hawaii is positioned to handle things like that? Do you think that more planning needs to go into evacuations, or how do you see us interacting in a way that's sustainable with the fires?
Yeah, I mean, well, just looking at this last one on Big Island, Mana Road, like they're beyond our capacity to put them out, right? That's, if nothing else like that, we could take no other lessons from that. Like that's the one thing that we know, like we can't stop these given what's out there. Like, I mean, the fuels, right? So we've got about 1 million acres of grasslands, give or take, on Hawaii, right? And so that's something these are going to continue to burn, and they're going to continue to burn and continue to burn unless you change the condition on the ground. And so what tools do you have available to you? That's where it becomes, that's pretty obvious. So we can look at grazing, you can look at reforestation. I think the big question is like, how do we fund it, right? Like what programs? We look at like grants. I mean, this is what is funding conservation and landscape management at this point, almost entirely are competitive grants. And I mean, I don't have like numbers off the top of my head, but like, if you look at the capacity, so as an example would be like, go look up the percentage of the state budget that goes to the Division of Forestry and Wildlife, right? Like it's teeny tiny, right? And then all of these watershed partnerships that are ones kind of with the knowledge of how to do this stuff. They're also just kind of scrapping for peanuts in the grand scheme of things. So again, I think it's the big challenge is kind of repositioning this as like a need. Like if we don't want to see these fires happen and we don't want to put communities at risk, we need to be thinking about these things at large spatial scales. Evacuations and sort of community action, I think, should be part of that. I mean, they evacuated Waikoloa, right? And then like kind of moving forward, there's other things that you could do in terms of planning at that sort of, urban interface area that are pretty smart. Like, so the big example that Hawaii Wildfire guys like to bring up all the time, and the firefighters too, is like, imagine you made Waikoloa, instead of with the golf course in the middle and the homes around it, if the golf course was on the outside of the community, right? Like you wouldn't have to worry. So, and like that example I gave at the beginning, like the only thing that didn't burn in Makaha Valley was the freaking golf course. So it's like, if you want to change conditions, we have the technology, right? We know how to manage vegetation. We know how to do these things, but the folks and the expertise is this pretty small piece of our kind of whole economic model that we're working with right now. And so again, it's not the how-to, it's just yeah, I mean, it's not like, what do we do here? The strategies we kind of know. It's like, how do we implement these things at scale?
Right. And part of it is this risk management, and then trying to identify, I think, first the threats to people, because we don't want people to be killed or injured in this. And then the second thing, and what I was really interested in, is can we use the roads? Can we think about, it's not just for evacuation but as part of the integration in terms of the fire breaks. Those are public investments. Have you ever seen anything that has said, no, this is a DOT project or a roads project to manage this? We have a UTC, a University Transportation Center, that focuses on those types of questions as well too. So I'm just wondering, what has been the investment in thinking about roads, both in terms of ignition management, but also other things that you've raised.
Yeah, it's come up a lot actually, and we feel like, again, so much of this is like just the right person in the right time, right? Like who you have, and we've not done. And I say we, this is like these collective efforts of working again with Wildfire guys and like the sort of again also with some of the partners and like board members in that group, but the advisors that I work with for Pacific Fire Exchange, where I think the best interactions that I've had in terms of roads have kind of been at the county level. So with planners and then also working with the invasive species committees. And they have been looking at this question of responsibility because they've been called to do like fountain grass removal, for example, along roads in Hawaii County. And they're like, wait a minute, maybe we need to kind of, extend this on to the Department of Transportation. Maybe it's there, and so there are kind of these questions of where those responsibilities lie and where where the expertise is to kind of deal with these things. For sure, I think most of the ignitions are roadsides,
right?
So right. It's definitely a problem. But again, as far as is Department of Transportation managing for fire risk? I think that they are definitely like clearing vegetation that helps with that. So you drive up H2 right now and you can see like along that roadside, they keep that pretty much trimmed up, and then the helicola goes and starts from there. But yeah, again, it's trying to kind of parse out who's responsible for what. And it kind of ties into these like large landholders too, right? Is like this comes up often in other sort of related is with the utilities, right? So I have to say, like, Hawaii Electric has been really proactive in terms of trying to figure out like what is it that they can do, right? And if you and I always because people, especially in Maui, are like always just like ready to strangle Miko every time there's a fire, but at the same time it's like there's all these fuels between, even if it started at a power line, you've got like thousands and thousands of acres of fuels between those ignition points and wherever, if it's your home or if it's the watershed forest, right? And so it's sort of, you have to look across the whole thing. You can't just say, yeah, it's their fault.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm going to give a teaser for next month's Third Thursday, which is on the use of vetiver grass, which we're trying to encourage as a green infrastructure tool as well too. And one of the concerns has been raised that what's the impact in terms of fire risk and so forth. But it's very interesting. I'm wondering, are there other questions? I see Heather has a question or comment. Heather, do you want to?
Oh yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. What sure. Hey, Clay.
Hi, Heather.
I was just thinking about you're on many projects, I know, but since you kind of touched on it a little bit about plants as fuel, I know like working with managers and trying to identify invasive species that are more fire promoting is something that's in your Kuleana work. And I don't actually know how easy or difficult it is, if that's a solution, to just remove fire promoting.
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard.
Kind of what I wanted to ask.
It's really hard work. And so I think that's, again, like thinking long-term. So if you're managing a grass, one of the problems we have, for example, is like getting federal funding to do this kind of work, is a lot of the money for fire mitigation, there's this pot of money called the WUI grant, Wildland Urban Interface Grant, the U.S. Forest Service manages. And for us in Hawaii to like mow a fuel break in the grass, like you're going to have to do that potentially multiple times a year. And one of the restrictions for like WUI funding, as an example, is that they want to see a treatment done once. They don't want to pay for maintenance. And so if you're mowing, it's like every time you get rain, you got to be out there, right, again, and mowing it again, or weed whacking, whatever. And so that's where kind of the revegetation, the technical term is like fuels conversion, right, changing that to something else. But again, it's a long-term strategy. And if you look at like sort of these restoration projects, they're limited by funding, of course, but like they're tackling like, you know, several acres a year at most, right? So that's, you know, and while you're sort of converting one area, you still have to worry about all the areas adjacent to it, right? That could potentially be threatening us. So it's a lot of work. It's pretty difficult to do, actually, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
To understand that better.
Yeah, and I see a question here. The meteorologist, that's a really good question. And we have a project with FEMA funding through HIEMA right now, with Tom John Beluga and Syed Bateni at University of Hawaii. And we're actually going to be developing daily. So Tom John Beluga's group is coming up with these daily rainfall and temperature maps. So it'll be like updated real time every day. And we're going to be building from that real-time fire risk maps for the state. And so that would actually be where part of that project we'll be working with National Weather Service, as well as fire managers like with Volcanoes National Park, places like that, and DOFA, to be saying, all right, like how can you integrate this into your forecasts? And so, for example, the only warning system we have right now is a red flag warning, and it's issued based on conditions at Honolulu Airport, right? So it's very spatially limited in the sense of like what clues and data do they have to work with. And so, yeah, we are working with meteorologists directly as well to try to improve that. ArcGIS feature services. So from that project, as far as the maps, I think what right now there's a Hawaii, oh my gosh, I'm going to mess this up because it's not mine exactly. The Hawaii Climate Data Portal, I think will be, this is again coming out of Tom John Beluga's group, will probably be how that data would be accessible. And I think it would be obviously like compatible ArcGIS, I'm imagining rosters, something like that. Sorry, Carl, I started driving the chat box from you.
No, that's okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, are there any other questions or comments? I know we're very, very interested in the potential collaborations and looking at the development of training courses and ways in which the research and development that we're doing with the center can fit in terms of much of the work that you're doing. I think Jeff Rubin had a thought that maybe this is something that could be incorporated into the brick competitions that
yeah, that's come up before, and I'm not sure about the specifics of the brick grants. I do know that for some of the FEMA grants, there's a spatial restriction. So if you're going to do fuels reduction work or something, and then I think it's like tied to like resilience and stuff, I think it has to be within a couple kilometers of a community. And so that's, I know, one of the restrictions, and I don't know if it applies to the brick grants or not. And actually, we've had discussions a few times now with Larry Conda at HIEMA about like trying to make a case, especially because of the nature of these grass fires and how quickly they move, that whether we could get like a special condition for Hawaii where we could kind of expand that buffer around these communities. But I don't know how that would work. I mean, as far as trying to petition FEMA for a change in their rules, but
it's probably worth looking into. I mean, I don't know the details about the scope, but it's different from all the other previous disaster mitigation programs. Every state and territory is eligible for at least the next 7 years. Cool. And the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, literally just said, think big on mitigation. Don't do the little stuff. So they have a series of webinars, they have information on the site. It's probably worth looking into if you're not sure.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. I appreciate it, the reminder. Yeah, because again, we're in a really good place with Hawaii Wildfire a couple years ago did this kind of big statewide effort to prioritize areas for fuels management. So we kind of like, we're in a position now where we could take a little coordination of like the players on the ground, but we know the areas where the need is highest at least. And so obviously any opportunities to fund this stuff is are relevant.
Yep, thank you, Jeff. Are there any other comments or thoughts for today's really excellent, informative session? I'm sure we'll have some follow-up, Clay. Thank you so much for a great presentation and sharing your knowledge and experience with us all. And we look forward to collaborating more with you in the future, because I think these are really important issues, really needed research and training and capacity building.
Yeah, appreciate the invitation. It was good to connect again.
Thank you, Clay. That was great.
Problem. Yeah, and
Thank
I just
you
put my email in the chat. So if anyone wants to just, they can reach out anytime.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.